Let's get back to the politics of the day. I'm joined here in the studio by David Gazard and Eamon Fitzpatrick. Great to see you both gentlemen. David, this story that Andrew Clennell has reported today on another minister being caught up by the strict code of conduct set by Anthony Albanese. But the fundamental point is if you set the rules and you run on issues like transparency and so on, you should be really dotting the I's, crossing the T's, shouldn't you?
Well, not only that, it goes to what Labor have demanded the coalition do in the past, while the current Prime Minister was in the shadow ministry. So if you go back, I remember this very clearly, when John Howard had his own code of conduct, there were months and months and months of Labor making assertions that the code had to be upheld, that Howard had written, and ultimately John Howard lost 5 ministers over the course of that term. So if you're going to make the rules, you've got to enforce them. And if you're going to hold your opposition accountable for the same breaches, you're going to be vulnerable yourself.
The ministers issued a response to Andrew, which I've got here as well, and it basically says that the healthcare sector, this is from a spokesperson, giving us this information that the healthcare sector is basically 10% of the listed share market. The vast majority of diversified funds on the market have a weighting of healthcare shares. They're saying there's no conflict, but when it's upwards of 10% health holdings in these funds, and she's the Assistant Health Minister, is that an issue?
Well, I think what's actually moved on here is we're now talking about a level of transparency where we actually know what people's shareholdings are. Let's not forget in the last term, the issue was we didn't know what people had shares in half the time or where they were getting money from. And that led to some pretty serious issues. In this case, this goes back to what's been raised in terms of some of Jeff's colleagues. Also, the Prime Minister's raised it, the Deputy PM's raised it. There are rules, and you are supposed to stick to them. And this is another example where they should be acting in accordance with those rules.
The Code of Conduct says that you can have funds, managed funds, but just not a significant interest in the area of responsibility with which you're the minister. Is double-digit percent, upwards of 10%, is that significant? I guess that might come down to that. Would the government argue that that's insignificant?
Can I just say the actual percentage, I don't think is that important. It is the perception of it that is going to kill the minister in this case. The perception is that she will have something, or could have a role in a decision that benefits those stocks. It's not really the level; it's the perception of, right. And this is why a lot of MPs, a lot of ministers tend to just divest themselves completely, right? They just don't want the perception that they had a conflict, right? And that's what kills you.
When you see these stories emerge early in a government, it would make a lot of ministers wake up and say, look, well, okay, we're in government now and we've talked a big game and we're seeing a few of our colleagues get caught in the crosshairs, so to speak, of these shareholder questions. It'll make a lot of people wake up and have a look, wouldn't it?
Well, you would expect that. And look, having worked for 2 prime ministers, there would be an expectation from the top down that the rules are very clear and that everyone needs to abide by those. Now, there's obviously some allowance, I think, given to particularly new ministers. And we're talking about someone who is incredibly hardworking, the sort of person we want in the Parliament because of her experience in health on the front line, a great representative, right? For not just the workforce, but for everybody. There are, I think, looking at this, as David says, you don't want to get caught up in what the actual number is, but it isn't helpful. And, I think it's just an example of, again, people just need to toe the line.
Well, let's look at the big political issue right now. That is cost of living. It's this diabolical scenario at the moment. The RBA is moving so fast. The 5 interest rate rises in a row, 4 at 50 basis points, and it's really got a bit of a lag effect as well. I spoke to one economist earlier who said no one knows whether they've hit the economy with a sledgehammer yet, or whether it's just a barely touched it. So it is a really precarious situation, David.
The RBA also sets its rates on the basis of what it thinks is going to do to inflation over the horizon. So it's out to 3 years, right? So it is trying to protect the economy now for what could be happening in 3 years' time. So what is clear is the economy is growing quite strongly. I mean, the performance of the economy of 0.9% over the quarter is actually a fantastic result. But there are all these inflationary pressures that have come in from, energy from overseas because of the Ukraine. There's supply issues that are driving up prices. There's been flooding. There's a whole range of effects that have got on. But the bank's concern is trying to stop inflationary pressures now, and it's setting the window for its policy decisions out 3 years' time. So there could be more of this to come, right? And this is why we're in a real squeeze now.
And that lag effect is that the rates increase is not necessarily hit by mortgage holders don't feel it within a couple of weeks. It takes a few months, and by the end of the year, they would have been hit with 5.
Then that's exactly right. But, you get into government because you want to tackle some of these problems. And that's why you do not do it by one or two things alone. You've got to bring that holistic package. It is over a period of time, and you've got to get all of those settings right. We're not immune. Australia is facing the same challenges everybody has. New Zealand's an example of that, where, I think they're a little bit in front in terms of trying to curtail all of this now. But we're certainly not alone, but you need to do it.
The Prime Minister's really trying to manage expectations about expenditure, certainly in the first budget next month.
Well, I think that's a sensible thing to do. They're early on in the term, so they have to be seen to be sensible, moderate. But then you've got announcements like they had today in terms of the cost of affordable medicine. So there's things you can try to do, but in the end, it's not going to be an isolated act. It's going to be a whole bunch of things you pull together and you do it over the term.
You've been around treasurers that have delivered budgets on many occasions. This is the first of a government in a first term. It's almost even more at stake here because it's setting the trajectory for the rest of their time in office.
That's right. It's a short term in Australia, 3 years, so you tend to move with your reform budget now. You then bed it down in the next one, and the one after that is the one you go into the election with, right? So it is a very, very compressed time frame. So this is where you take the tough decisions, right? I expect tough decisions, but for the Treasurer now, he would be thanking his lucky stars that the government did not take his advice and continue JobKeeper indefinitely at the cost of $8 billion a week, right? Because it would be a whole lot worse for him.
Indeed, especially when they're saying they're not going to do the fuel excise at what a cost of, I think it's about 4 or 5 billion.
It's pretty tough because these come with a very high price tag.
They do indeed, and this, as I said with David, the first budget of a first term, a lot at stake, and a lot at stake for Jim Chalmers delivering his first.
Yep, I think so. But he's a guy he is not inexperienced himself. We know what his sort of experience has been. He was working for Wayne Swan. He was Wayne Swan's chief of staff. He's been one of the leading lights in terms of Labor's economic policy. He is a guy who is very...
The best media performer.
Well, that's, again, and this will require a lot of explaining, 100%. But absolutely, in keeping with the traditional cycle, you get the tough things up early out the way. You do need to set a few themes, and they do need to send a message that some of the things that happened previously have to come to an end.
Eamon Fitzpatrick from Fitzpatrick Advisory and David Gazard from DPG Advisory. Gentlemen, great to see you both.